VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Women, Peace and Security, Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. Ms. Angelina Jolie, Special Envoy of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Ms. Kino Mar, on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. And Ms. Nadia Karine-Therese Fornel-Poutou, Executive President Association des Femmes Juristes de Centrafrique. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S2020-487, the report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, and document S2020-665, a letter dated 8 of July 2020 from the Permanent Representative of Germany, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. This debate will look at how Resolution 2467, which was introduced by Germany last April, has helped prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence. We will look at how 20 years after the adoption of Resolution 1325, we can better implement the whole women, peace and security agenda. We will discuss what the newly introduced survivor-centered approach entails in practice and how we can ensure the rights of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. We will look at how to hold perpetrators of sexual violence accountable for their crimes. And we will try and identify ways to ensure that parties of armed conflicts comply with international obligations and international law. Let me now warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and high-level representatives today. We are also honored to have with us 4 experts today. Ms. Pramila Patten, Ms. Angelina Jolie, Ms. Kino Mar, and Ms. Nadia Karine-Therese Fornel-Poutou. Our discussion today will be enriched by your presentations, and I very much look forward to hearing from you. We will now hear from our distinguished briefers. I give the floor first to Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflicts, to brief us on the recent report of the Secretary General.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, we meet today to find effective ways to turn commitments into compliance and resolutions into results. We meet in the spirit of pursuing a survivor-centered approach which ensures that survivors of wartime sexual violence will not be forgotten, even in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic that has captured the attention of the world. In this regard, I would like to sincerely appreciate the leadership of Germany in convening this debate during exceptionally challenging times, and to particularly thank His Excellency Mr. Heiko Maas, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs, who chairs this meeting for the 2nd consecutive year. I also extend my appreciation to the Dominican Republic for its support and collaboration at all stages of the planning process. I warmly welcome the civil society briefers from Myanmar and the Central African Republic, as well as Special Envoy Angelina Jolie, who will lend their unique voices to our collective search for solutions. The annual report of the Secretary-General before us today paints a somber and harrowing picture of sexual violence used as a tactic of war, torture, and terror, and a tool of repression to dehumanize, destabilize, and forcibly displace populations. This is a crime that shreds the very fabric that binds communities together, leaving social cohesion and safety nets threadbare. It is a biological weapon, a psychological weapon, an expression of male dominance over women, and of one group over another. Conflict-related sexual violence is a crime that sets back the cause of gender equality and the cause of peace. These are interlocking issues. More gender equality means greater social stability, and the inverse is also true. The report before us documents almost 3,000 UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed over the course of a single year. The vast majority of incidents, 89% to be precise, targeted women and girls, though over 100 confirmed cases also affected men and boys and LGBTQI individuals. 848 cases were attacks on children. Behind every figure presented in the report is a human story. Too often, it is the story of a survivor who walks in shame while the perpetrator walks free. It is the story of a military or political leader who feels above the law and a civilian who has fallen beneath the scope of his protection. Accordingly, the report emphasizes the imperative of a survivor-centered approach as articulated by this Council for the first time in Resolution 2467 of 2019. A survivor-centered, rights-based approach requires tailored solutions that build resilience, restore voice and choice to survivors, and address the diverse experiences of all affected individuals. In this way, it tackles intersecting inequalities and root causes to ensure that no one is left behind or excluded from the dividends of peace and development. As I have seen firsthand in the field, war does not speak with just one voice. There are countless stories that are shrouded in silence and left off the historical record. Diverse life experiences must inform policy, operational, and funding decisions. If these decisions are not gender-based in their design, they will be gender-biased and exclusionary in their effect. Mr. President, the report spans 19 countries of concern. Each country section includes a targeted recommendation that can be cited at relevant moments, such as peacekeeping mandate authorizations, country-specific deliberations, sanctions decisions, or the design of peace negotiations, ceasefire agreements, and transitional justice processes. To highlight a few examples, following my visit to the Central African Republic in May of last year, I advocated for the government to nominate a special advisor to the president to work with my office on advancing implementation of the joint communique on conflict-related sexual violence. In other settings, key legislative reforms are recommended, such as the adoption of the long-pending sexual offences bill in Somalia, or the draft law on the prevention of violence against women in Myanmar. In South Sudan, the United Nations has been engaging with armed groups following the abduction of hundreds of women and girls in Western Equatoria. Many are still languishing in military bases, and the report calls for their immediate release. Likewise, in Syria and Iraq, many Yazidi women and girls have not yet been released from ISIL captivity and remain missing, in desperate need of services and family reunification. In post-conflict contexts, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, survivors of sexual violence are still fighting to realize their rights and status as legitimate victims of war in order to access reparations and redress. Moreover, older sexual violence has been widely used as a tactic of terrorism in contexts such as Iraq, Nigeria, Mali, Somalia, and Syria. It has not been prosecuted as such. Mr. President, every report about wartime rape also testifies to its underreporting. This is linked with fear of stigmatization and reprisals, lack of access to services and the justice system, and harmful social norms around honor, shame, and victim blame. The Monitoring, Analysis, and Reporting Arrangements, or MARA, have deepened the evidence base for action. Yet, the MARA is only as effective as the resources and capacity behind it. Women protection advisors who convened the MARA have improved the quality and quantity of information. 86% of cases documented in the report come from settings where women protection advisors are deployed. The report also lists 54 parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of sexual violence in situations on the agenda of this Council. Over 70% are persistent perpetrators, having appeared on the list for 5 or more years. For the first time, this year's report features an assessment of compliance gaps, which notes the prevailing disregard for international norms and obligations by parties to armed conflict. It finds that the majority of persistent perpetrators have not made meaningful commitments to curb violations. There is accordingly an urgent need for greater coherence between the practice of listing and the practice of imposing targeted and graduated measures to leverage behavioral change. We know that sexual violence is characterized by staggering rates of impunity and recidivism. It is time to usher in a new era of enhanced monitoring and enforcement, bringing all tools to bear. It is time to change the calculus of belligerents who operate on the assumption that rape remains cost-free. Aid sanctions regime now includes sexual violence within their designation criteria. Designating parties for these crimes sends a powerful political signal. Since 2009, my mandate has engaged constructively with numerous parties, resulting in the signing of 10 joint communiques or frameworks of cooperation with states, and has encouraged the adoption of unilateral communiques and codes of conduct by several non-state armed groups. This experience has shown that strategic dialogue is most effective under the shadow of a credible threat of accountability and enforcement. As the report notes, we have rarely seen linear progress from commitments to compliance, owing to an ever more complex global security environment. Mr. President, sexual violence does not occur in a vacuum, but is tied to broader risks, such as resurgence of hostilities, rising violent extremism, militarization, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, population displacement, and collapsed rule of law. These factors trigger renewed patterns of sexual violence, which the report finds to be concentrated in contexts of abduction, captivity, displacement, detention, and in remote rural areas where women undertake essential livelihood activities. In addition, there is constant oscillation between progress and regression, forward momentum and backlash on women's rights. We began 2020 anticipating a jubilee year for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, with the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 and the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration for Action and the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter with its founding promise of gender equality. Yet, we find ourselves fighting to prevent the rollback and reversal of hard-won gains. The report draws attention to the global political climate of pushback on women's rights evident in reprisals against women human rights defenders, physical and financial risk to women's civil society organizations, and shrinking civic space. Anniversaries and annual reports are not just about looking back, but also looking forward. They serve not only to measure progress, but to inspire and accelerate it. It has been said that the one thing stronger than all the armies in the world is an idea whose time has come. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, reflected in 10 robust resolutions, is that idea. It is not an issue that can wait until urgent matters are resolved. It is a strategy for resolving them more equitably and fully. It is a way of adapting to the changing face of conflict in the 21st century. Mr. President, needless to add that the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically affected the work of the United Nations, and my mandate has not been spared. But what the virus has not changed are the needs of survivors. What has not changed is the right to physical integrity and bodily autonomy. Also unchanged is the fact that war and rape rage on in the Central African Republic, the DRC, Somalia, South Sudan, and elsewhere. In this climate of intersecting crisis, one thing is clear. It is time to silence the guns and to amplify and unmute the voices of women. The Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire means that all parties must cease the use of sexual and other violence. Mr. President, distinguished Council members, today's debate sets the stage for a new decade of decisive action along three main lines. Firstly, empowering survivors and those at risk through enhanced resourcing and quality service provision to foster an enabling environment in which they can safely report violations and seek redress. Secondly, acting on the reports and information received to bring parties into compliance with international norms. And thirdly, enhancing accountability as a critical pillar of prevention and deterrence, ensuring that when parties fail to comply with their commitments, they are duly held to account. Prevention is the best response, yet we have struggled to measure or even define progress on the prevention pillar of this agenda. Compliance is a concrete example. Sexual violence persists not because existing frameworks and obligations are inadequate, but because they are inadequately applied. Resolution 1820 of 2008 demanded nothing less than the immediate and complete cessation by all parties to armed conflict of all acts of sexual violence against civilians. This resolution wrote a new norm and drew a red line. Now we must clearly demonstrate the consequences of crossing it. We must keep these crimes and their perpetrators in the spotlight of international scrutiny. As the well-known legal maxim reminds us, justice must be done and be seen to be done. Survivors must be seen by their societies as the holders of rights that will ultimately be respected and enforced. Thank you.
Pramila, thank you very much for your briefing. And I now give the floor to Ms. Angelina Jolie, Special Envoy of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And let me say we are very honored to have you here with us today. Angelina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Foreign ministers, members of the Security Council, good morning. I am grateful to Germany and the Dominican Republic for holding this debate within the framework of Women, Peace and Security Agenda. I'm honored to speak alongside Special Representative Patten and our brave colleagues from Myanmar and the Central African Republic. Entrenched discrimination in society and the gendered impact of sexual violence demands the actions are taken for survivors. I would like to speak today about one of the most overlooked groups of survivors, the children. When Resolution 2467 was adopted last year, it was the first to put survivors and their needs and their rights at the center of all actions. But resolutions, as we know, are words on paper, and just that, they're promises. And what counts is if those promises are kept. As every member of this council knows, and every parent knows, there's nothing worse than breaking a promise to a child. Yet that is what we are doing, year after year, to countless children. The fact that we will never meet them does not lessen the betrayal. I have met child survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence and trauma and abuse everywhere. There is no continent untouched by these crimes. There is no country, rich or poor, that should not take a hard look at its own laws, its own agencies, its own media reporting of these issues, its own treatment of survivors, and its own social attitudes. But I want to start, if I may, with one example. When the so-called Islamic State attacked the Yazidi community in Iraq in 2014, they abducted, enslaved, and tortured thousands of women and children. Many children were murdered, but nearly 2,000 have returned. Many suffered post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression. They experienced flashbacks and recurrent nightmares that are typical of children who have experienced trauma and abuse. Many of the children witnessed the murder of their relatives and the rape of their mothers. One doctor who has provided medical care for Yazidi women and girls said that almost every girl she had treated between the ages of 9 and 17 had been raped or subjected to other sexual violence. In some cases, the victims were girls under the age of 9. They suffer serious health issues, including traumatic fistulas and scarring, in addition to trauma, difficulty accessing education, and even a struggle to prove their identity. Yet, according to a forthcoming report by Amnesty International based on interviews with survivors, humanitarian workers, and other experts, there are still very few services available for Yazidi child survivors and children born of rape. And what services there are have been largely focused on women survivors who have immense trauma and unmet needs of their own, made worse by displacement, poverty, and lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. The reality is that no one is getting the care they need. But there is specific lack of dedication for the children. One mother whose daughter was abducted when she was 6 years old and survived 3 years of beating and abuse could not get medical help for her because she was considered too young to treat. Every humanitarian worker interviewed for the Amnesty International report said that the psychosocial services and programs currently available to Yazidi children fall far short of meeting their long-term specialist needs. I have heard this replicated in every conflict setting I have visited for nearly 20 years with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. To be clear, the lack of services flows from the failure of the international community to provide the funds to make this possible, as well as the political will. Sexual and gender-based violence is the most chronically underfunded sector of the humanitarian appeals of the UN, receives less than 1% of humanitarian assistance. So think of how many lives could be saved if we simply doubled that percentage. So I pay tribute to all the humanitarian workers, medics, lawyers, and human rights defenders doing everything in their power to help survivors around the world, often with next to no support. But my concern and my question to the Council is this. If we are not able to live up to our promise of a survivor-centered approach for the Yazidi children, who make up just one relatively small group of survivors, then how many more children and young adults are suffering in silence at a global level? How many more will suffer because of the violence exacerbated by COVID-19 and a distracted international community? The answer is we don't know. The UN Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict said that sexual violence, crimes against children, which are only one of the ways that children's rights are being violated globally, are vastly underreported. The Secretary General's report on sexual violence in conflict last year described a disturbing trend of violence against very young boys and girls in multiple countries. It added that girls and boys are targeted in order to terrorize their communities because of perceived affiliations of their parents or their perceived utility or market value. Their perceived utility or market value. Nobel laureate Dr. Mukwege speaks of treating babies as young as 6 months old in his hospital for rape victims. We live in a world where child survivors of these crimes, of violence of all crimes, live with stigma and gaslighting and fear of retaliation at the hands of powerful perpetrators. Where in some countries, rape is not illegal, and girls are forced to marry their rapists. And where survivors face an endless cycle of denial of their rights as well as stigma and ostracization, lasting decades after the conflict has ended, as in Bosnia or Uganda, and passed down across generations to innocent children. More often than not, in many settings, including Syria and Myanmar today, not a single perpetrator of alleged systematic conflict-related sexual violence has been held to account. Not a single one. These are all choices. The choices of the member states. Our choices. We have to be prepared to admit where we have failed and to do the hard work to support the survivors, change the laws and attitudes, and bring the perpetrators to account. Over many years, no matter the country or circumstances. And so far, we are not even coming close to this. Resolution 2467 also promised sanctions, justice, and reparations for victims and recognition for children born of rape. And these promises must be kept. So I urge you all to recommit to these promises today, to move beyond rhetoric and to implement your decisions. Please hold perpetrators account. Please address root structural causes of gender-based violence and discrimination in your countries. Please urgently increase funding for programs that address the needs of all of the survivors, especially the children. Thank you.
Angelina, thank you very much for this briefing, and of course, thank you very much for your important work as Special Envoy too, and please go on with it. Next, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Kinomar, who will speak on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security.
Mr. President, Excellencies, my civil society colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and deliver this statement on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. For over 30 years, I've advocated for democracy, human rights, gender equality, and peace in my country, Myanmar. I've met with countless survivors of the unspeakable crimes committed by Myanmar's military against minoritized ethnic and religious communities. I stand here today in solidarity with my sisters and brothers still waiting for justice. Myanmar's military has long used rape as a weapon of war against the ethnic communities. The horrific accounts of Rohingya women during the 2016 and 2017 so-called clearance operations remain urgent, shocking, and unique in their ferocity. They are also representative of the military's pattern of using gender-based violence in their campaigns against other ethnic communities, including the Kachin, Shan, Ta'ang, and Rakhine. These facts are well known. One of the first comprehensive pieces of documentation was produced nearly 20 years ago by the Shan Women Actions Network, which detailed incidents of sexual violence committed by Myanmar's military against 625 Shan women and girls. Of the rapes that were documented, 61% were gang rapes and 25% resulted in death. Women were detained and raped repeatedly for months. Similar findings by Kachin, Karen, and Ta'ang women's organizations, as well as by the Women's League of Burma, corroborate many of these findings. These organizations have unequivocally concluded that sexual violence is part of a deliberate, systematic pattern to target ethnic women and girls. This fact was confirmed last year by the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar, which found that sexual violence was a hallmark of the Tatmadaws military operations. The FFM further documented systematic and widespread sexual and gender-based violence against Rohingya women and girls, transgender persons, as well as men and boys in the 3 waves of violence that ultimately brutally uprooted over 800,000 Rohingya from their land and homes. The FFM stated that the use of rape and sexual and gender-based violence against the Rohingya, and I quote, was part of a deliberate, well-planned strategy to intimidate, terrorize, and punish a civilian population and force them to flee. It concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that these acts, and I quote again, constituted crimes against humanity, war crimes, and underlying acts of genocide, accompanied by inferences of genocidal intent. Despite this well-documented pattern of the use of sexual and gender-based violence, and the government signing a joint communique with the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict in December 2018, Myanmar continues to deny that such crimes are taking place at every opportunity. It rejected allegations of rape as wild claims in its report to the CEDAW Committee in 2019, and ignored sexual violence against the Rohingya entirely at the International Court of Justice hearings in December 2019. Myanmar's Independent Commission of Inquiry also categorically dismissed rape and sexual violence in its final report in January 2020, furthering the impunity accorded to the military for this crime. As Professor Philip Sands, a lawyer for the Gambia, told the ICG last winter, Myanmar silences far more than its words. The FFM also noted that sexual and gender-based violence is being carried out within the broader context of endemic and structural gender inequality and discrimination against women and girls across all levels of society, and that the net result is a climate of impunity that enables sexual and gender-based violence to continue unabated. This impunity permeates every corner of the domestic legal system and judiciary, and is grounded in a constitution that entrenches military impunity. Investigations, if they are even begun, are blocked, and witnesses are threatened or even targeted for violence. And when there are convictions, they are exceedingly rare, often not for sexual violence, and the penalties are not commensurate with the gravity of the acts committed. This was seen in the case of 2 Kachin school teachers who in 2015 were tortured, raped, and murdered in northern Shan state. The primary suspect was a commanding officer in a local Myanmar military contingent, yet at every turn, efforts to seek justice were thwarted. Independent investigations were blocked by the highest level of government. Civil society has consistently called for addressing these egregious structural gaps in the domestic justice and legal system without any progress. A law on violence against women that took over 7 years to draft, which failed to consult meaningfully with women and fails to meet Myanmar's international obligations, has only recently been submitted to Parliament to debate. The Myanmar National Human Rights Commission has exhibited a lack of will to investigate violations carried out by members of the military. Mr. President, despite the COVID-19 pandemic and the UN General Secretary's call for a global ceasefire, the conflict in Myanmar has reached an intensity not seen in decades. As recently as late June, the Myanmar military announced clearance operations against the ethnic Rakhine and the Arakan Army. The conflict has resulted in widespread displacement and human rights abuses, including restrictions on access to the internet. The situation of displaced Rohingya, Kamen, Rakhine, Chin, and other ethnic communities has been exacerbated by the restrictions enacted in response to the pandemic. Barriers to accessing sexual and reproductive health care have only grown, compounding the already life-threatening lack of services for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and putting such services even farther out of reach for women and girls from marginalized communities. Serious international crimes continue to be committed throughout Myanmar, but particularly in Rakhine State by the same perpetrators that committed genocide against the Rohingya. Yet no one is being held to account as the military continues to act with total impunity. As the FFM has repeatedly said, domestic accountability is not possible in Myanmar. Neither does the country have an effective national framework for protecting women's rights or upholding gender equality. Unless the international community acts now, these abuses will continue and can have lasting consequences. The confiscation of land, compounded by patriarchal land-owning practices, government-led development plans, and the encroachment of business interests means that women's dispossession risk becoming permanent. I therefore urge the Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the ICC or to create an ad hoc international tribunal to more fully investigate the crimes suffered by the Rohingya as well as those against other ethnic communities. In addition, the international community, including the Security Council, must make a concerted effort to ensure that Myanmar complies with the provisional measures ordered by the ICJ. Far more action is needed to ensure that discriminatory laws are repealed, citizenship is restored to the Rohingya, and restrictions on freedom of movement and humanitarian access are lifted. As the Rosenthal inquiry, which examined the UN's failure to halt atrocities, rightly recognized, it is vital that the UN sees this moment as a key turning point and speaks in a united, decisive, and principled voice to ensure that there is never another systemic failure such as the one in 2017. I urge the UN Special Envoy to resist the government's dangerous nationalist and divisive narrative and not to lend legitimacy to the national verification card process that aims to deny the Rohingyas' very existence. Mr. President, I'm not the first woman from Myanmar to speak before the Council. My Rohingya sister, Razia Sultana, addressed you at this very debate in April 2018. In addition, many of my brave ethnic sisters have repeatedly called on the international community to act on behalf of other ethnic communities. The Karen, the Kachin, the Rohingya, the Rakhine, and others have all faced great suffering at the hands of the Tamador. Who is next? Who else must come before you to urge you to hold the Myanmar military to account? As women human rights defenders and community leaders from different ethnic backgrounds, we will continue to work for a peaceful, democratic Myanmar. This is a decisive moment in our history ahead of the national elections this year. We urge you to support our efforts for justice, peace, and accountability that serves all the people of Myanmar. Thank you, Mr. President.
Omar, I thank you very much for this briefing. And now I give the floor to Ms. Nadia Karine-Thérèse Fornel-Poutou, Executive President of the Association des Femmes Juristes de Sans-Trafic. Ms. Fornel-Poutou will address this council in French, and you have received the English translation of her statement in writing.
Excellences, chers collègues activistes, chers invités, mesdames et messieurs. Je suis Nadia Karine Fornel-Poutou, présidente exécutive de l'Association des femmes juristes de Centrafrique. L'Association des femmes juristes de Centrafrique travaille sur la protection des droits de l'homme et soutient les survivants de violences sexuelles basées sur le genre en leur apportant un accompagnement psychosocial, une assistance juridique et en les orientant vers un centre médical. Ces services sont notamment fournis par des centres d'écoute où des juristes et des agents psychosociaux travaillent dans le but de lutte contre l'impunité et d'aider les survivants à surmonter leur expérience traumatisante, par exemple en leur apportant un soutien psychosocial. Membre active de la société civile, je totalise plusieurs années d'expérience professionnelle dans le domaine de la protection et la défense des droits de la femme et de l'enfant, la lutte contre l'impunité et la prise en charge juridique des violences basées sur le genre en République centrafricaine. Je tiens à remercier le gouvernement allemand pour cette occasion de partager quelques réflexions sur la situation de la violence sexuelle en République centrafricaine. J'espère que ma déclaration incitera toutes les personnes présentes à poursuivre notre important travail visant à mettre fin à ces pratiques horribles. Pour comprendre la situation à laquelle nous sommes confrontés au quotidien en RCA, je souhaite partager l'histoire d'une des femmes, filles que nous avons soutenues ces dernières années. L'histoire est celle-ci. J'ai 17 ans. J'ai grandi à Bangui. En 2013, les éléments de la Séléka sont rentrés dans la ville de Bangui. 4 hommes sont arrivés à notre domicile alors que j'étais avec ma maman et ma petite sœur. Ils étaient grands, habillés en tenue militaire, leurs visages voilés par des tissus noirs. L'un d'eux a demandé où étaient passés les hommes de la famille. Ma mère a répondu qu'il n'y en avait pas. Ils l'ont giflé et ont jeté ma petite sœur au sol. Alors qu'elle pleurait, un des soldats lui a arraché ses vêtements, l'a brutalisée, poussée à même le sol et l'a violée. Pendant que j'observais, les yeux pleins de larmes, leur chef a dit qu'il fallait qu'on me fasse la même chose. J'avais très mal et malgré mes cris, ils ne se sont pas arrêtés. Les douleurs dans mon ventre ont duré 1 mois. On m'a conduite à l'hôpital de Bimbo, où l'on m'a dit que j'étais enceinte, mais l'enfant était mort dans mon ventre. Fin de l'histoire. Excellences, chers collègues activistes, chers invités, mesdames et messieurs, en 2019, le total des cas de violences basées sur le genre pris en charge et enregistrés par les acteurs du sous-cluster violences basées sur le genre en République centrafricaine était de 13 028 cas, parmi lesquels les femmes et les filles étaient au nombre de 12 249 cas contre 779 cas concernant les hommes et les garçons. Les agressions physiques, viols et violences sexuelles représentent la moitié des cas. Parmi les cas recensés par l'Association des femmes juristes, 15% concernent les hommes, 95% des femmes. Il s'agit d'une sous-représentation probable des hommes qui sont encore plus stigmatisés lorsqu'ils sont victimes de ces crimes. Ces graves violations des droits de l'homme trouvent leur origine dans les conflits et les normes socio-culturelles et de genre en vigueur. Depuis plus de 2 décennies, la République centrafricaine fait face à des conflits armés à répétition avec des conséquences désastreuses sur la population, sans oublier la violence sexuelle généralisée, principalement commise sur les femmes et les jeunes filles. Les auteurs font majoritairement partie des groupes armés. Le plus souvent, ils visent les personnes notamment en raison de leur appartenance à un groupe ethnique ou religieux, de leur zone d'habitation quand celle-ci est supposée peuple de milices rivales. Dans certains cas, les troupes déployées pour assurer la protection de la population, à la fois nationale et internationale, commettent des atrocités, créant ainsi une méfiance de la part de la population centrafricaine vers ces troupes. Les survivants sont de tout âge, y compris les enfants de moins de 10 ans. Les viols sont souvent commis par plusieurs agresseurs, parfois allant jusqu'à 20 pour une même personne en public, devant les membres de la famille, dans la communauté, ce qui détruit le tissu social. Outre les conséquences sécuritaires et socio-économiques du conflit sur l'ensemble du pays, la population civile, les femmes et les enfants en particulier, sont affectés par des graves violations des droits de l'homme, telles que la confiscation et l'occupation des terres, l'enrôlement des enfants dans le groupe armé.
Non, on a un jour, je ne touche plus. Si ça s'arrête, encore ça reprend.
Sorry, Niger, il faut fermer votre microphone. Merci.
Depuis le début de la crise, les services de protection sont absents, soit dysfonctionnels. Des mesures ont été prises par le gouvernement, appuyées par la communauté internationale, à savoir la création et la mise en place d'une structure étatique, l'unité mixte d'intervention rapide UMIR, la création et l'opérationnalisation de la Cour pénale spéciale. La réforme du secteur de la justice contribue à la restauration de l'autorité de l'État et la confiance des populations dans la justice. De même, le gouvernement a adhéré et mis en œuvre les résolutions 1820 et 1888 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies qui reconnaissent et condamnent le viol comme arme de guerre et crime contre l'humanité. La question de sécurité reste une préoccupation majeure pour une justice véritable et équitable en RCA, où les auteurs de ces crimes et les survivants se côtoient au sein de la communauté. On ne peut lutter contre l'impunité dans l'insécurité, ni parler de la justice dans un contexte où les armes circulent librement. Excellences, chers collègues activistes, chers invités, mesdames et messieurs, nous vous demandons en tant que membres du Conseil de sécurité de vous assurer que la MINUSCA assure réellement la protection des civils contre les graves violations du droit international humanitaire comme stipulé dans son mandat. Renforce les forces armées centrafricaines et les forces de sécurité intérieure de manière à assurer leur efficacité, inclusivité et responsabilité, particulièrement sur les violences sexuelles basées sur le genre et l'exploitation et abus sexuels. Deuxièmement, nous demandons aux membres du Conseil de sécurité de soutenir les organisations de la société civile en appuyant leurs efforts, en particulier sur des organisations des droits des femmes, pour que celles-ci puissent soutenir les survivants de violences sexuelles basées sur le genre dans leur autonomisation économique et leur réinsertion dans la société. De nous soutenir concrètement en tant qu'organisation locale et d'assurer notre accès aux mécanismes de l'ONU dans la prévention des violences sexuelles et sexistes. de renforcer les investissements dans la prise en charge holistique des survivants. Par exemple, en investissant dans des services de santé sexuelle, de reproduction inclusive et dans l'accès à la justice. Troisièmement, nous demandons aux membres du Conseil de sécurité de soutenir le développement du système judiciaire en renforçant l'unité mixte d'intervention rapide et de réflexion UMIR qui lutte contre les violences sexuelles basées sur le genre pour qu'elles soient autonomes et aptes à traiter objectivement les cas qui lui sont soumis. En appuyant les tribunaux ordinaires nationaux et la Cour pénale spéciale, tout en les encourageant à considérer avec la plus haute attention les cas de violences sexuelles liés au conflit et à assurer la protection des survivants et témoins tout au long de la procédure judiciaire. Et en plaidant pour que les actes de violence sexuelle liés au conflit fassent l'objet d'une attention particulière de la part de tous les mécanismes de justice transitionnelle, judiciaire et non judiciaire. Les survivants ont particulièrement besoin d'un système de justice fonctionnel qui soit efficace et sensible à la dimension de genre, ainsi que d'autres mécanismes qui permettent de traduire en justice les auteurs de ces violences et d'accorder des réparations aux survivants. Enfin, conformément à son solide mandat sur la femme, paix et sécurité, le Conseil doit s'enquérir des efforts de la mission de maintien de la paix afin de combler cette lacune critique en matière de services et de justice des survivants, aussi pour assurer une participation égale et significative des femmes dans le processus de paix et les processus électoraux, y compris la mise en œuvre de l'accord de paix et au cours de la prochaine élection présidentielle. Excellences, chers collègues activistes, chers invités, mesdames et messieurs, merci de votre attention. Nous nous réjouissons de travailler ensemble pour un avenir sans violence sexuelle en République centrafricaine.
Fornel-Poutou, I thank you very much for your briefing. And ladies and gentlemen, I thank all of our briefers today for their honest and insightful accounts, and I really admire your courage and determination. Your observations are essential to guiding our discussion today. And you have highlighted so many areas where the Security Council and the international community need to do more, to do better, and to end of conflict-related sexual violence. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are talking about a pandemic, a global virus much older than COVID-19, but equally devastating. Sexual and gender-based violence and conflicts has been destroying lives and community for years, with no vaccine in sight. 20 years after Resolution 1325 and more than a year after the adoption of Resolution 2467, progress remains painfully slow. Rape, forced prostitution, and sexual slavery continue to be used as weapons in conflicts around the globe. I can only commend the courage and strength of our briefers in speaking up and sharing their experiences with us. Thank you very much for that. We all heard how COVID-19 is making survivors' situation even worse. Lockdowns are restricting survivors' access to medical and legal services. The underreporting of sexual violence has become even more alarming. And while we are able to uphold safe distances between us, many women, girls, and boys cannot escape the brutal proximity of their terminators. Today's debate is therefore overdue. And I want to thank the Dominican Republic for co-organizing it with us. As co-chairs of the informal expert group of this council, our message is clear. Implementing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, including Resolution 2467, is a duty for all of us and for this council, even more so in times of COVID-19. 4 points will be key. First, we need to ensure that survivors get the medical and the judicial assistance they deserve. As an example, Germany is working closely with the Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Together, we are defending survivors' sexual and reproductive health and rights, including access to medical services and repatriations. Second, women must play a central role in peace building. Without gender equality and human rights, lasting peace and reconciliation remain impossible. Germany thus supports NGOs such as Together We Build It in Libya, which promotes the political participation of women in the peace process. And third, sanctions can and must play a bigger role in ending sexual violence. The 2 UN listings that have been brought forward since 2019 can only be a first step. And fourth, impunity must end. Perpetrators must be brought to justice. We support creative solutions such as the mobile courts in South Sudan that try rapists around the country. And I'm glad to report that in Koblenz, in Germany, a court recently opened the world's first trial against 2 former officials of the Syrian regime, on charges of torture and sexual assault. Ladies and gentlemen, these examples show we may not have a vaccine against the pandemic of sexual violence, but we are certainly not powerless. What we need to do is act upon the commitments we made in Resolution 2467 to protect and empower survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and to place them at the heart of our action. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Dr. Naledi Pandor, Minister for International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa. Naledi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to thank you, Minister Maas of the Federal Republic of Germany, for convening today's open debate on women, peace and security, sexual violence and conflict. This is a very important focus for the Security Council, and it must be one that we continue to devote our energies to in order to ensure that we implement the commitments we have made to address sexual violence and conflict. Our country, South Africa, wishes to express its sincere gratitude to the Secretary General's representative for her detailed annual report on conflict-related sexual violence. We also welcome the reports from the briefers who have spoken to us today. This debate serves as a useful monitoring mechanism to assess the progress made in addressing the scourge of sexual violence in armed conflict situations and the challenges that continue to require the attention of the international community. While there are old conflicts that still exhibit severe sexual violence against women, we're seeing that we're not succeeding in ending this blight against women and children because new conflict situations continue to exhibit patterns that have existed for decades. Thus, Mr. President, it is vital that this trauma against women and girls is addressed by ourselves as members of the United Nations, and that it receives specific focus by the Security Council. We need to ensure that all parties that commit such acts are brought before the appropriate structures and are held accountable. Over the years, we've successfully developed global awareness about the effects of armed conflict on women, and we have seen action certainly through the structures of the United Nations. The resolution adopted in the year 2000, Resolution 1325, was a groundbreaking step for us as the UN family. All subsequent resolutions on women, peace, and security have served to strengthen this initiative. Through these outcomes, the Security Council has recognized that sexual violence as a tactic of war used systemically to achieve military or political ends is a threat to international peace and security, and one that we must combat robustly. Regrettably, as we've heard today, this form of violence continues to occur in most conflict and post-conflict situations, and so remains a subject of grave concern for my country, as it is for this council as well. Ending this scourge requires us to hold those responsible for committing these heinous acts accountable, and also requires us to attend to the needs of the victims and survivors, who should remain our priority. Mr. President, while the situation of women and girls remains desperate and unacceptable, we must not view women and girls merely as passive victims, but as members of society with voices and competence. We must deepen our efforts to systematically change perceptions about women and girls and acknowledge their resilience, their self-empowerment, and the meaningful role that they can play as agents of change and transformation. Our country recognizes that sexual violence is directly linked to gender inequality. We therefore must continue to advocate for the equal participation and full involvement of women in all processes and structures dedicated to the maintenance and promotion of peace and security. The onus is on us as member states to continually look at measures to strengthen the full and effective implementation of all decisions of the Council, including the recommendations of the 2015 global study related to women, peace and security, in line with the Council's Resolution 2493, adopted last October at an open debate on women, peace and security. That resolution again re-emphasized the imperative of implementing all Council decisions on women, peace and security. And thus what our debate today illustrates is that we are failing at implementing our own decisions, and we must identify why this is so and reinvigorate the measures that must be taken to truly address the plight confronting women in our society. Our discussion today must result in us converting commitments into compliance. This would respond to the urgent call of the victims of this pandemic. Our country, South Africa, commends and reiterates its support for the efforts of the Office of the Special Representative on sexual violence in conflict. The efforts of ending sexual violence in armed conflict situations and the excellent work done by the Special Representative requires our support and acknowledgement. The work of this office has become more important given the myriad challenges brought about by the global pandemic confronting all our countries today, by the reality of internally displaced people, particularly women and children, by the reality of a growing number of world refugees and migrants. It is also due to this office that we are able to monitor and react to the reported rise of sexual and gender-based violence during the course of this COVID-19 pandemic. We reiterate the Secretary General's call that addressing gender-based violence must be integral to the COVID-19 response. While we have put policies in place to mitigate the scourge of sexual violence, implementation still lags far behind our ambition. There's still room for us to improve, as has been so clearly outlined by Madame Fornel. We need to act on the 3 appeals she has placed before us and ensure as member states we support the initiatives she has asked us to give attention to. We must ensure that all the measures to enhance accountability against perpetrators, such as the prohibition of states listed for violations from participating in UN's peace operations, and sexual violence being a designation criteria in sanctions regimes in country situations. All of these must be implemented and implemented consistently. Mr. President, while we recognize the constraints of reporting on all situations of concern, we would appreciate receiving reports on more than just the 19 situations which are focused upon in the report of the Secretary General. Conflict situations such as the experiences of women in Palestine and in Western Sahara, where human rights violations are prevalent and where women are affected by the ongoing hostilities, should not escape Council's scrutiny. This, we believe, will ensure that there is no selectivity or bias in reporting and will allow the Council to maintain objective credibility of UN processes. On our part, we as member states need to mitigate some of the serious negative impacts of sexual violence, such as stigmatization, discrimination, rejection, and social exclusion. All of this requires sustainable and predictable funding. Therefore, there should be consistent funding for programs aimed at combating sexual and gender-based violence in conflict situations, including the protection of sexual and reproductive health and rights. There should be easy access to services for victims and survivors of sexual violence, such as clinical treatment of rape, medical, psychosocial, and legal services, as well as reintegration support for victims and survivors. Mr. President, this year is a significant year as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1325, the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action, and the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Charter of the United Nations. It is also the review year for Africa of silencing the guns on the African continent. These commemorations will be hollow if we do not take steps to fulfill their objectives and implement the ideals and commitments that we have all made by adopting these landmark outcomes. In this regard, as South Africa, we underscore the need for enhanced cooperation through better information sharing, coordination, and cooperation between the UN, regional and sub-regional organizations, as well as with civil society and women's organizations, in order to ensure we advance the cause of women's rights and their empowerment. This meeting, Mr. President, is convened just a day before the International Mandela Day, which will mark the 102nd birthday of our great icon, former President Nelson Mandela, who once stated that freedom cannot be achieved unless women have been emancipated from all forms of oppression. In this spirit, let us each do our part in chartering the path for justice for the women, girls, and children of today and of the future. Once more, Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting, and I hope we will do better as we continue to fight this scourge. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lady, for that. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Philippe Goffin, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defense of Belgium. Philippe, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, thank you, Heiko. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, ces dernières années, la communauté internationale a pris des mesures importantes pour s'attaquer au problème de la violence sexuelle liée au conflit. Cependant, dans son rapport annuel, le secrétaire général signale de nouveau un grand nombre de cas de violence sexuelle dans les zones de conflit et d'après-conflit. À cela s'ajoute un grand nombre d'exactions non déclarées en raison des craintes et de la stigmatisation des victimes ou encore de la restriction de l'accès. La pandémie de Covid-19 rend la situation encore plus complexe. Dans de nombreux endroits, la crise a entraîné une réduction du contrôle social, un accès plus difficile à l'assistance ou aux autorités judiciaires et des obstacles aux droits sexuels et reproductifs. La Belgique remercie l'Allemagne d'avoir organisé cet important débat. Mon pays remercie également les briefers. Leurs interventions nous rappellent que la situation actuelle exige des efforts supplémentaires et un engagement renouvelé. Monsieur le Président, je souhaite aborder 3 points. L'importance d'une approche axée sur les rescapés, la nécessité du respect effectif des engagements pris et enfin, la lutte contre les causes profondes des violences sexuelles. Premièrement, les rescapés de violences sexuelles ne constituent pas un groupe homogène. Qu'il s'agisse de garçons violés en République centrafricaine, d'esclaves sexuels de Daesh ou de mères d'enfants nés de la violence au Soudan du Sud, les personnes rescapées ont toutes leur propre histoire. Elles ont toutes besoin de solutions adaptées. Elles ont besoin de justice, d'un accès aux services de soins de santé, d'un soutien psychosocial, de réparations significatives ou d'un soutien socio-économique pour se réinsérer dans la société. Bien que la question des réparations après des crimes de violence sexuelle liés au conflit ait suscité un intérêt de plus en plus marqué à l'échelle mondiale, l'octroi de réparations reste l'exception malheureusement. Pourtant, les efforts entrepris pour octroyer des réparations aux rescapés de violences sexuelles liées au conflit ont donné quelques bons résultats, par exemple en Colombie ou encore en Irak, où un programme d'aide aux personnes rescapées a permis le déblocage des premières sommes en 2019. Il faut tirer les leçons des expériences des rescapés pour mieux prévenir d'autres violations, pour mieux reconnaître les signes précurseurs tels que la discrimination, les discours de haine et l'incitation à la violence. Pour mieux faire la collecte des preuves, la Belgique se félicite du projet du Code Murad à cet égard. Monsieur le Président, mon deuxième point concerne le respect effectif des engagements pris. Le degré d'observation des résolutions du Conseil de sécurité demeure malheureusement faible ou trop faible. Les chiffres interpellent. Pas plus qu'un seul acteur étatique a été radié de la liste figurant en annexe du rapport annuel depuis qu'elle existe. 71% des parties qui n'ont pris aucun engagement sont inscrites sur la liste depuis plus de 5 ans. Or, ce que veulent les rescapés, c'est la fin de l'impunité, c'est la justice. Documenter les crimes est une étape essentielle. Nous saluons les efforts de la représentante spéciale à cet égard. La présence sur le terrain de conseillers pour la protection des femmes est aussi pour contribuer à accroître la quantité et la qualité des informations. Sauvegardons les arrangements de suivi, d'analyse et de communication de l'information sur les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. L'accès à la justice est également crucial. Or, cet accès dans les zones de conflit est souvent insuffisant en raison de cadres normatifs inadéquats, de la capacité limitée des institutions de l'état de droit ou de manque de confiance vis-à-vis des acteurs étatiques qui peuvent perpétrer eux-mêmes des violences. À cet égard, la Belgique soutient et salue le travail de l'équipe d'experts de l'état de droit et des questions touchant aux violences sexuelles liées au conflit. En République centrafricaine, par exemple, les experts ont contribué à l'organisation d'une session de la Cour d'appel de Bangui consacrée aux affaires de violences sexuelles et sexistes. Ce conseil peut aussi agir directement. Dans toutes les résolutions et ces résolutions sur les violences sexuelles, il réfère à l'instrument des sanctions ciblées contre les parties qui commettent des violences sexuelles. Or, à ce jour, aucun auteur n'a jamais été visé par des sanctions précisément pour ce motif. À quoi servent ces intentions qui ne se traduisent pas dans des actes concrets au bénéfice des rescapés? La question est posée. Monsieur le Président, les crimes de violence sexuelle ne cesseront que si nous nous attaquons aux causes profondes de la violence sexuelle. Œuvrons donc de respect pour une égalité des sexes, pour la véritable participation des femmes au processus de paix, pour l'inclusion de l'autonomisation des femmes au cœur des mesures de prévention, pour un soutien accru aux organisations de défense des femmes et des défenseurs des droits humains sur le chemin balisé par la résolution 1325. Monsieur le Président, une décennie après le premier rapport des Nations Unies sur les violences sexuelles liées au conflit, une action soutenue et des pressions politiques incessantes restent indispensables pour changer la situation et la faire évoluer. Mettre fin à la violence sexuelle contre les femmes et les filles et garantir la santé et les droits sexuels et reproductifs sont également des éléments essentiels du plan d'action national belge Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. Je souhaite ici aujourd'hui reconfirmer notre engagement continu. La Belgique, l'Union européenne et l'ONU restent partenaires dans ce combat important. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Philippe. And I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Elbak Seynabou Taribako, Minister for the Advancement of Women and Child Protection of Niger. Excellency, can you hear me? Okay, then I would
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur Heiko Maas, Mesdames et Messieurs, c'est pour moi un honneur de prendre la parole à l'occasion de ce débat public annuel sur la violence sexuelle liée au conflit. Le thème est plus que pertinent dans un contexte mondial caractérisé par une recrudescence des violences basées sur le genre en général et la violence sexuelle liée au conflit en particulier. Comme si les guerres n'étaient pas assez dévastatrices, des milliers de personnes souffrent de violences sexuelles inhumaines en temps de conflit, commises comme stratégie de guerre, de répression politique, de torture et de terreur. Le rapport du secrétaire général des Nations Unies sur les questions vient confirmer cette triste réalité. C'est une question qui nous concerne tous et qui doit être combattue. C'est pourquoi le Niger se félicite de cette importante réunion et remercie la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général Pramila Patten ainsi que les représentants de la société civile pour leur exposé édifiant. S'exprimant à l'occasion de la Journée internationale pour l'élimination des violences sexuelles en temps de conflit, le prix Nobel de la paix Denis Mukwege nous a rappelé que de tels actes provoquent la désintégration du tissu social et compromettent toute perspective de paix durable. Monsieur le Président, je voudrais attirer l'attention du Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU et des États membres sur la situation particulière de vulnérabilité accrue à laquelle sont confrontées les populations dans la région du Sahel. Depuis quelques années, la zone des 3 frontières et le bassin du lac Tchad font face à une situation d'insécurité aggravée par plusieurs facteurs tels que la présence de groupes armés terroristes, la prolifération d'armes légères, l'insuffisance d'opportunités socio-économiques, les tensions communautaires et l'exclusion des jeunes filles et garçons aux sphères décisionnelles. Il a été constaté que la violence à l'égard des femmes et des filles connaît une recrudescence sans précédent, notamment dans les régions de Difa et Tillabéri, où celles-ci subissent de dures épreuves. Ces actes constituent une violation de leurs droits humains. Dans la région du bassin du lac Tchad, des groupes terroristes tels que Boko Haram procèdent à des enlèvements de filles et de femmes pour ensuite intégrer ces dernières de force dans les rangs des combattantes. Les mariages forcés, l'esclavage sexuel et l'exploitation économique deviennent le lot quotidien de ces victimes. Nous avons tous en mémoire l'enlèvement des filles de l'école polytechnique de Chibok et de Pati au Nigeria, et celle moins médiatisée mais tout aussi douloureuse des femmes de Nglewa au Niger. Au courant du premier trimestre 2020, dans cette région de Difa, 54 incidents d'enlèvement pour 144 personnes, dont 48 femmes et 29 enfants ont été arrêtés. Le Niger appelle les États membres à soutenir la réintégration des personnes victimes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit armé, avec une approche axée sur les personnes rescapées et les survivantes, telle que préconisée par la résolution 2467 du Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU. Cette approche est importante d'autant plus qu'elle prendrait en compte les spécificités du contexte. Dans la plupart de nos communautés, ces actes de violence sexuelle sont difficiles à monitoriser, car rarement signalés, soit parce que les services compétents n'existent pas, ou parce que les familles soumises à des forces pesanteurs socio-culturelles ont peur de la stigmatisation. Les victimes souffrent en silence. Monsieur le Président, ce travail de prise en charge des victimes de violences sexuelles ne peut être fait de manière adéquate sans données contextuelles. C'est pour cela que mon département ministériel a réalisé en 2015 une étude sur l'ampleur et les déterminants des violences basées sur le genre au Niger. Ce travail de recherche a relevé qu'au Niger, 53% de la population subissent ou ont subi des violences basées sur le genre au courant de leur vie. Les enfants constituent une frange importante des personnes touchées par ces violences, avec comme notamment le mariage d'enfants. Le taux de prévalence nationale de violences basées sur le genre est de 28,4%, alors que le taux de prévalence de la violence sur la population féminine est de 60%. Les femmes et les filles sont donc plus susceptibles d'être victimes de violences basées sur le genre au Niger. Les situations d'urgence, les crises humanitaires liées aux catastrophes naturelles et les déplacements des populations qui en découlent aggravent la vulnérabilité des femmes et des filles. Dans tous les premiers instants d'un désastre, ces groupes vulnérables peuvent être exposés à des risques spécifiques tels que leur séparation avec leur famille, qui peuvent les rendre vulnérables à la traite, aux enlèvements et aux agressions sexuelles. Monsieur le Président, conscient du fait que ces violences constituent un frein à la réalisation des objectifs de paix, de développement durable et de promotion des droits de la personne humaine, notre pays a pris des mesures législatives, juridiques, institutionnelles et administratives pour y remédier. Le Niger a entre autres inscrit la violence faite aux femmes et aux filles au rang des priorités nationales dans les constitutions de la 25 novembre 2010. Notre pays a également adopté en 2010 l'ordonnance relative des personnes et en particulier l'adoption nationale de prévention et de réponse aux violences basées sur le genre en 2017 fut une étape décisive dans la mise en œuvre du plan d'action national sur la résolution 1325 et l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité. Nous attachons une très grande importance à la prise en charge holistique des survivantes aux violences sexuelles, surtout dans les zones les plus touchées par la crise sécuritaire, et avons à cet effet créé des centres dans les régions de Difa et de Tel Aviv. Les personnes en situation de déplacement forcé y sont particulièrement vulnérables car les populations déplacées, dont la majorité des femmes et des enfants, ont souvent moins de possibilités et d'accès aux services de base, ce qui peut les exposer à différentes dont les sexuelles. C'est le moyen efficace de lutter contre les violences sexuelles liées au conflit et la prévention, y compris l'accès à une éducation de qualité. À ce titre, le Niger a mis en place des centres de prévention et de promotion de protection de l'enfant, les CEP, qui font des activités préventives concernant la communication pour un changement de comportement et de la prise en charge des cas de victimes de violences basées sur le genre. Par ailleurs, si notre pays a eu des avancées significatives dans le domaine de l'éducation, les attaques contre l'éducation et les écoles deviennent de plus en plus préoccupantes du fait des conflits. Nous devons protéger l'accès à l'éducation, en particulier pour les filles. C'est un moyen sur les paliers des causes profondes de la violence sexuelle, parmi lesquelles la discrimination sexiste, le manque d'opportunités économiques et la masculinité toxique. L'accès à l'éducation peut contribuer durablement à combattre la pauvreté, remédier aux inégalités entre les sexes et donner tout simplement la dignité. Le Niger a d'ailleurs signé la déclaration sur la sécurité dans les écoles et nous invitons les États membres, pas encore signataires, à en faire de même. Pour conclure, le Niger voudrait émettre quelques recommandations additionnelles. Premièrement, relativement à l'adoption d'une approche axée sur les personnes rescapées, il est important que les membres mettent en place juridiques et judiciaires au-delà des dimensions sanitaires, psychologiques, sociales et économiques. L'Agence nationale de l'assistance juridique et judiciaire au Niger en est un exemple. Deuxièmement, cette approche doit être contextuelle et y inscrire des actions de proximité communautaire avec une prise en compte des mécanismes traditionnels de prise en charge. La société civile au Niger fait un travail remarquable sur ce point en collaboration avec les autorités locales et les organisations des femmes. Troisièmement, la mise en œuvre ne peut se faire sans données fiables et désagrégées sur les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Cette étape est importante pour assurer une mise en œuvre plus effective de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité sur laquelle nous portons des réflexions profondes à ce tournant décisif pour cet agenda. Et enfin, les zones
Oh, I think
nationales. Je peux continuer, s'il vous plaît?
Yes, please. We can hear you again.
Ok. Donc, notre pays, en tant que contributeur de troupes, appelle à davantage d'efforts pour garantir que ces questions soient prises en compte dans le y compris par le renforcement des systèmes d'alerte précoce. Dans ce contexte mondial marqué par la pandémie COVID-19, les violences basées sur le genre, dont les violences sexuelles, sont malheureusement en hausse. Notre pays, le Niger, réitère son engagement pour combattre les violences basées sur le genre et les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Et je vous remercie de votre aimable attention. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. I thank Her Excellency Ms. Tari Bako for her statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon.
You are the only participant.
Special Envoy of the Prime Minister for Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. Tariq, the floor is yours. Tariq, we can't hear you. No, we can't hear. I don't know, it doesn't work. I would propose that we come back to you, Tariq, after the next speaker, and then I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic, please.
Mr. President, I take this opportunity to thank Germany for hosting this debate on an issue that is so dear to the Dominican Republic and for which we are honored to have collaborated with Germany. I would like to acknowledge the leadership and eminent work of Ms. Pramila Patten and her office, and to thank her for her informative briefing. I also thank Kim Omar, Nadia Karim, Fornel-Poutou, and Angelina Jolie, all of whom I would like to express my admiration. Thank you for taking us to the heart of the harsh realities on the ground. Conflict-related sexual violence have gained more attention, precisely political attention, at the highest levels, but a collective response is still needed. Gender equality and the human rights of all women and girls is essential to achieve peaceful societies, but they often bear the brunt of the conflict, lacking the necessary protective measures and becoming more vulnerable to sexual violence. As we approach the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 and just commemorate the 10th anniversary of Resolution 1888, a unified approach is even more crucial, as well as exploring the root causes and effects of conflict-related sexual violence, how to enhance preventive mechanisms, promote survivor-centered responses, and ensure justice and accountability. These are areas in which we will focus. In analyzing the Secretary General's report, we are dismayed to note that despite the significant progress in the last 10 years, sexual violence has remained a cruel scourge and has worsened in various conflict settings, continuing to be a cruel tactic of war, torture, terror, and political repression, and a brutality effective tool of displacement and dehumanization. In addressing sexual violence in conflict, we need to identify solutions and approaches that are context-specific, inclusive, and informed by experience, especially that of survivors. Survivors must participate in decision-making processes to ensure that the initiatives promoted address their concerns fully. In that vein, a rights-based, survivor-centered approach must be at the heart of these programs. Interventions and investments and incorporate a robust gender perspective mainstream across the whole spectrum of activity at all levels. This must include psychological and legal support and access to comprehensive services, including sexual and reproductive health rights. Mr. President, accountability remains elusive. We must convert the culture of impunity into one of accountability as an essential component for redress to victims and to strengthen the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. It is vital to incorporate sexual violence as a criterion into all sanctions committees and that perpetrators listed in the annex of the Secretary General's report are held accountable. Similarly, gender experts must be mandated to the sanctions committees to better identify the perpetrators of sexual violence and prompt action provided for by international legislation in that area. Likewise, the informal experts group of women on women, peace and security that Dominican Republic co-chairs with Germany is a platform of immense value in monitoring the compliance of state and non-state parties to conflict. Moreover, the number of women protection advisors deployed must increase, be fully funded, and be given the level of seniority needed to carry out their work. They have proven to be an effective instrument to combat and prevent conflict-related sexual violence and to encourage survivors to report allegations of crimes committed. Addressing conflict-related sexual violence is also challenged by underreporting, which has already dramatically been further suppressed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Restricting survivors' ability to report these crimes. Additionally, the pandemic risks prioritizing services needed by survivors, including in shelters, healthcare services, police and justice services. Let's guarantee that gains are not derailed. This Council should not lose sight of the gender impact of arms. Security sector reforms and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration are urgently needed. We recognize the invaluable work carried out by local and civil society, many of them women and youth organizations, as well as human rights defenders. Activists, including those with us today, have shown great courage in speaking out on the enormous and lasting damage done by the crime. In conclusion, addressing this problem can be hampered by particular interests or politicization. Preventing and addressing the sexual violence in conflict is possible when all stakeholders remain truly committed, work together, and in a coordinated and coherent manner. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic for his statement, and now back to London. I give the floor to His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon, the Special Envoy of the Prime Minister for Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. I hope it works.
Mr. President, he's not there at the moment, still trying to reconnect. If we could move to the next speaker, please.
Okay. Dear colleagues, the next speaker is the representative of the United States. Please.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you for hosting this debate to discuss the survivor-centered approach to addressing sexual violence and conflict. We appreciate the participation of our briefers today, as well as their contributions in this important effort. We cannot discuss sexual violence and conflict without acknowledging the very serious impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on women and girls. When we discussed the pandemic on July 2nd, we talked about the impact of self-quarantine and stay-at-home orders as an exasperating risk factor for the gender-based violence, particularly intimate partner violence against women. We are pleased that Resolution 2530 quickly addresses.
UK, your microphone is open. If you could please mute it.
Specifically addresses this dynamic. The United States brought sexual violence and conflict to the attention of the Security Council in 2008 when the Council passed Resolution 1820. Since its inception, we have been an ardent supporter of the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict. Sexual violence and conflict is a matter of international security. It requires continued leadership and action from the United Nations and from all member states. Sexual violence and conflict inflicts trauma that extends far beyond survivors. It degrades individuals, fuels instability, forces people to flee their homes, and fractures families and societies. It is linked with other forms of violence and abuse, including child, early and forced marriage, and sexual slavery. Many perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict are non-state actors, and the increased presence of gender advisors in UN missions is helping collect information on these terrible crimes. Strengthening the capacity of rule of law institutions will be critical to advancing credible and inclusive accountability processes for past crimes. This year's debate on sexual violence and conflicts holds a newfound significance as our work evolves to focus on a survivor-centered and rights-based approach to the issue. This approach empowers survivors by respecting their rights and prioritizing their needs. For the Trump administration, this means ensuring that survivors have access to appropriate, accessible, and quality services, including healthcare, psychological and social support, security, and legal assistance. These services allow survivors to recover and fully participate in reconciliation and development. We read the Secretary General's report on sexual violence and conflict with great interest, particularly the portion dedicated to the Central African Republic. We know from the report that armed groups and signatories to the 2019 peace agreement are continuing to use sexual violence and conflict as a tactic of war. That's why the Trump administration is supporting sexual violence survivors in the Central African Republic and training personnel from the judicial system to initiate investigations and prosecutions of gender-based violence crimes. In doing so, we are increasing the availability of legal resources for victims and conducting a public information campaign on sexual and gender-based violence. This work is aligned with our own Women, Peace, and Security Strategic Implementation Plan by Ivanka Trump. Addressing sexual violence in all forms requires many entities and organizations acting together. We must ensure that humanitarian efforts and relevant organizations integrate prevention and mitigation of sexual violence, including through making greater use of age and sex disaggregated data and strengthening support services for survivors, beginning in the earliest stages of humanitarian response. Mr. President, we know that collectively we can hold perpetrators of sexual violence and conflict accountable and ensure compliance with commitments to end sexual violence and conflict as a tactic of war. The Trump administration is doing our part, supporting gender-based violence programming with more than $150 million in 2019 foreign assistance funds. We will continue to work with civil society, including women, human rights defenders, and the SRSG to strengthen compliance with previous commitments to eradicate sexual violence and conflict. We, each of us, we owe this to ensure every victim has a voice and that every victim is heard. With this very important meeting today, we are telling those victims, we hear you, we will not stop doing our part to make sure that the world hears you too. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the representative of the United States for her statement. And now back to London. Tariq, the floor is yours. And I hope it works now.
So do I. I could say, I can ask now, Berlin, can you hear me? Heiko, Mr. President, thank you. And it's a delight to join you from London, notwithstanding connection problems. This happens when it gets too hot in London. There we are. But it's my immense pleasure and honor to join you again on this very important subject. I remember a year or so ago working with you, Heiko, on 2467 and the importance that it did bring to bear. I know Angelina Jolie mentioned in her contribution about how important it was putting survivors at the heart of our approach, and also the reference to children. And I think that's reflective of the real challenge we have in front of us. In doing so, I again want to pay especially tribute to my good friend, SRSG Patten. Pramila, your leadership on this role is exemplary, and we look forward to further strengthening your hand and the role of the UN on this important priority for us all. I also want to record my thanks to the other briefers, to both Ms. Omar and to Ms. Fornel-Poutou, for your insights that you brought from specific live conflict challenges that we're currently facing. Your briefings have really once again set a compelling base and renewed a determination for all of us, I feel, to do so much more. Amongst my responsibilities as a minister, as our president today mentioned, I'm the Prime Minister's Special Representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict. And I am honored by the role that I have and the leadership we have been able to show over several years now from the UK in our determination to work together with partners in tackling these appalling, abhorrent crimes. And I'm proud of our record of working together on this. Since 2012, the UK has committed over £46 million supporting worldwide efforts with a single objective: to eradicate this scourge. Yet we continue to witness, as we've heard again today, the suffering experienced by so many survivors. And so we put those survivors at the heart of our efforts. And I'm delighted we have two survivors directly advising me, the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister on our efforts on this important priority. But not only our efforts are to respond effectively and compassionately where incidents occur, but also our efforts must be to stop this happening to anybody else. Accountability, as we've already heard, is a critical part of this. First, because for many, achieving justice is a vital step to the road to recovery. Second, because ending impunity is a crucial deterrent in preventing future violence. When we look at conflicts of the past in Iraq and Bosnia, we know how long justice can take and continues to take. And that is why the United Kingdom continues to commit to strengthening justice for all survivors and to holding perpetrators of these horrendous crimes to account. This means upholding the highest international standards of evidence collection. It means aiding efforts to secure convictions. And crucially, it means protecting survivors from further harm when they report crimes and making investigation safer and more ethical. Pramila, I recall our visit to Iraq when we sat there and met Yazidi victims of the atrocities of Daesh, who had gone through the worst horrors against the person. When you see their eyes, it just compels you. It prioritizes in your own mind how much more needs to happen and needs to be done. And we must tackle the conscious and unconscious bias that still exists within the criminal justice systems and build the capacity of judges and prosecutors to understand the impacts of these crimes. In light of the current pandemic, this approach is even more urgent. Limited legal services are under strain, and diverted government resources have further narrowed the bandwidth for safe, survivor-centered reporting. We also know that survivors' journeys do not end in the courtroom. And we've heard before, and we've heard today from SRSG Patten and Special Envoy Jolie about the importance of supporting, not just talking, but providing and giving. And that's why I'm proud to announce the United Kingdom's £1.3 million contribution to the Global Survivors Fund. This fund was launched by Nobel laureates Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad, whose work has championed reintegration, redress, and restorative justice for so many. And we'll also be proud to be working with Nadia Murad on the Murad Code for all those seeking to engage and collect evidence. It supports community action through grassroots organizations and survivors networks. This fund supports states and civil society to cater to the specific concerns of their survivors and communities. And most importantly, as I'm sure everyone acknowledges, it places survivors' voices firmly at the center of its work, spearheading efforts for a truly survivor-centered approach to justice. Finally, 15 months since the passing of Security Council 2467, we must all recognize that the only response to sexual violence is a survivor-centered response. The more we empower survivors to lead, the more effectively we support their reintegration, their recovery, and our ability to respond to these abhorrent crimes. This means safeguarding minimum standards for investigation and preventing harm through the Murad Code, through the implementation of the highest standards through the Murad Code. It is supporting all survivors and children born of conflict-related sexual violence. It is funding crucial initiatives like in South Sudan that have reached 700,000 women, girls, men, and boys to empower survivors and support their recovery. It is about raising awareness of the devastating impact of these crimes and tackling the appalling stigma that too many face. And finally, it is why we must prevent these crimes, including those committed against the youngest and most vulnerable, by supporting international commitments like the Safe Schools Declaration to keep girls and boys safe, secure, and successful in their lives. This year, as we proudly mark the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, conflict-related sexual violence still remains rife. It remains real to so many around the world. We have a collective responsibility to ensure UN Security Council Resolution 2467 becomes an equally historic resolution by holding member states and the UN accountable to implement our collective obligations. It is not a minute too soon to turn words into action, ideas into reality, and commitments into concrete change. And it is only through concerted, collaborative international effort we will succeed in eliminating the horror of conflict-related sexual violence. And I continue to look forward in working with partners, with United Nations, but most importantly, survivors, to put them at the heart of our response. It's time for justice. It's time to put survivors first. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Tarek, for your statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of France. Nicolas, good to see you. Good to hear you. The floor is yours.
Dankeschön, Herr Minister. Monsieur le ministre, Excellences, je souhaite remercier nos intervenantes du jour et rendre hommage à tous les acteurs, en particulier de la société civile, pour leur travail sur le terrain. Je salue également l'action de l'Allemagne et de la République dominicaine à la tête du groupe de travail informel sur l'agenda Femmes, paix et sécurité. Nous partageons les préoccupations exprimées dans le rapport du secrétaire général, l'accès des victimes à la justice et aux soins de base, notamment aux services de santé sexuelle et reproductive, sont des défis majeurs, en particulier dans le contexte de la pandémie de Covid-19. Nous regrettons la politisation de ces questions au détriment de l'intérêt des femmes et des filles. Nous condamnons avec la plus grande fermeté le recours aux violences sexuelles comme tactique de guerre et de terreur, avec pour objectif de traumatiser durablement les populations et miner ainsi tous les efforts pour trouver une issue aux crises. La lutte contre l'impunité est la meilleure des dissuasions. Les responsables de violences sexuelles doivent être poursuivis et condamnés de manière systématique. Cela doit être une priorité au niveau national. La justice internationale a également un rôle à jouer en cas de crimes de masse. Nous soutenons à ce titre l'action de la Cour pénale internationale. La prévention des violences sexuelles implique de s'attaquer aux inégalités de genre. Les violences sexuelles restent exacerbées par les discriminations, préjugés et stéréotypes. La montée de discours politiques ouvertement sexistes, misogynes ou homophobes renforce les violences sexistes et sexuelles. Ce Conseil a bien identifié les solutions pour combattre ce fléau. Lorsque la participation des femmes à tous les niveaux des processus de décision est assurée et qu'une véritable attention est accordée à leur émancipation économique et sociale, les sociétés sortent des crises renforcées, plus justes et égalitaires.
la prise en charge des survivantes de violences sexuelles, y compris lorsque les procédures judiciaires sont inaccessibles ou bloquées, est essentielle. C'est pourquoi la France a décidé d'accorder 6,2 millions d'euros au Fonds mondial Mukwege Mourad. La prise en charge doit être globale. À cette fin, la France a financé en 2019 à hauteur de 5 millions d'euros un projet d'autonomisation des femmes par un meilleur accès aux services de santé sexuelle et reproductive et la prise en compte des violences sexuelles dans la région du Wadi Fira au Tchad. Madame la représentante spéciale, votre rôle d'alerte et de documentation est central. Nous continuerons de soutenir la prise en compte des violences sexuelles liées au conflit dans les résolutions pays et de plaider pour des ressources adéquates pour les équipes sur le terrain. L'urgence est à l'action. La France s'y emploiera, et notamment dans la perspective du Forum Génération Égalité que nous organiserons en lien avec le Mexique, ONU Femmes et la société civile. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Je remercie le représentant de la France pour sa contribution. Minister Maas had to leave, so I am taking over the chair, and it's now my pleasure to give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Germany for organizing this debate in commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and 1 year after the adoption of Resolution 2467, a landmark document on conflict-related sexual violence. I also thank the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, for her briefing and her insight on countering this heinous crime. I also take this opportunity to thank all the other briefers for their valuable contributions. We commend the efforts undertaken to eradicate and prevent sexual violence, and we praise the gains achieved in the Women, Peace and Security Agenda since the Office of Special Representative was created more than 10 years ago. Tunisia engaged to consolidate women, peace and security since the adoption of the Resolution 1325 in 2000, while holding an elected member in the Security Council. At the national level, Tunisia National Action Plan on the implementation of Resolution 1325, which was adopted on August the 8th, 2018, embodies a clear vision on ensuring gender equality, the empowerment of women, and the rejection of all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination. Mr. President, we are gathered today to consider consolidating the gains and progress achieved in the implementation of Women, Peace and Security Agenda, with a particular focus on conflict-related sexual violence and the necessity to consolidate accountability and to promote a survivor-centered approach. Conflict-related sexual violence has become regrettably a common feature in conflict zones, as it is increasingly being used as a weapon of war. We commend the Secretary General for his comprehensive report and his focus on the importance of bringing to justice the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. The Secretary General stated in his report that compliance by conflict parties with the Council's normative framework remains low after a decade of concerted focus. Also, we welcome the publication in May 2020 by the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict of a policy brief on implications of COVID-19 for the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. The document states that the pandemic had already begun to disrupt the work of the UN including the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence. We are concerned that the pandemic will also increase the exclusion of women from many peace and political processes. Mr. President, we view Resolution 2467 adopted in April 2019 on conflict-related sexual violence as a fundamental pillar of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. This resolution confers to the Security Council a crucial role in strengthening and monitoring implementation of relevant commitments by parties to conflict. It also highlights the role the United Nations can play in supporting local, national, and regional efforts to address the needs of survivors of sexual violence in conflict. Tunisia takes this opportunity to call on states to provide service and care to victims, including legal and psychological services and socio-economic support in line with the survivor-centric approach. Sexual violence will not be halted if perpetrators continue to benefit from impunity. Holding perpetrators of sexual violence to account to deliver justice to victims and to prevent future crimes is of utmost importance to the protection of civilians. In this regard, we view that the role of Security Council sanctions committees is crucial to fight impunity through expanding designation criteria for individuals who perpetrate sexual violence in the context of armed conflicts. In conclusion, I would like to state that crimes of sexual violence will stop only if we adopt a clear approach based on deterrence, on ending impunity and promoting prevention through bringing national legislation in line with international norms on standards and addressing the root causes of sexual violence in conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. China commends the German presidency for hosting this morning's open debate. I thank SRSG Pramila Patten and Special Envoy Angelina Jolie for their briefings. I also thank civil society representatives for their presentations. The year 2020 marks the 25th anniversary of the World Conference on Women in Beijing and the 20th of Security Council Resolution 1325. Reflect upon and renew our commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment, and also to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Throughout the years, many actions have been taken to advance the development of women and girls across economic, social, political, and peace and security domains. Meanwhile, gaps remain between words and actions, ambitions and realities. Women and girls are still bearing the brunt of wars, suffering the most from terrorism and displacement, and are at particular risk of sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. China strongly condemns sexual violence in conflict, especially the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war and terror. Taking this opportunity, I would like to highlight 3 points. First, all countries should work together to build a peaceful and prosperous world free from conflict. As Secretary General pointed out in his recent report, the ultimate goal of the agenda of sexual violence in conflict is not a war without sexual violence, but a world without wars. The best and the most effective way to protect women, girls, and other vulnerable groups from sexual violence is to prevent conflicts from happening and resolve these conflicts by peaceful means. Therefore, the international community needs to redouble its efforts to preserve peace for development, promote development for peace, and address the root causes of armed conflicts. The Security Council should effectively implement its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security by promoting peaceful settlement of disputes through dialogue, mediation, and negotiation, and ensuring the timely and complete implementation of the resolutions it has adopted. In this context, we reiterate our strong support for Secretary-General Guterres' appeal for a global ceasefire and urge all parties to conflicts to heed this appeal and realize a general and immediate cessation of hostilities. Second, a holistic approach is needed to promote gender equality, advance women's empowerment, and address sexual violence in conflict. The spirit of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda is recognizing women not only as victims of war, but as contributors to peace with strength and expertise. Gender equality and women's empowerment are key to this transformation and for women to fulfill their potential. We need to intensify efforts on gender equality to remove structural disparities, eliminate discrimination and stereotypes, and ensure women's equal access to education, healthcare, and decent work. We also need to move faster on empowerment of women, to lift them out of poverty, increase their representation and leadership in decision-making, and strengthen their role in implementing the SDGs. As the Secretary-General observed in his report, sexual violence in conflict does not occur in a vacuum. It's often linked with factors such as resurgence of hostilities, collapse of the rule of law, mass displacement, rise of terrorism, and violent extremism, and etc. We need to adopt a holistic and comprehensive approach in combating sexual violence in conflict, making sure that the proposed solutions take economic, social, political, counterterrorism, security, and humanitarian aspects all into consideration. Our response must tackle both immediate threat and the long-term consequences, and should be carried out in a coordinated and integrated manner. Third, we need to join hands to eliminate sexual violence in conflict while respecting national sovereignty and ownership. Building on the existing normative and the institutional framework, we must support actions on preventing and deterring sexual violence at national, regional, and international levels. We must do our best to protect and assist survivors, always prioritizing their needs and rights, and hold the perpetrators accountable. In this connection, the countries concerned bear the primary responsibility. As almost all governments whose national forces listed in the Secretary-General's report have resumed formal commitment in this regard, it's time to fill the gap between commitment and implementation. The international community should step up its assistance to relevant countries for national capacity building. In the meantime, national sovereignty, jurisdiction, and the legal systems, and the principle of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs must be fully respected. UN bodies, including the Security Council, General Assembly, ECOSOC, and the UN Women, special representatives and envoys of the Secretary-General, and UN missions on the ground should all work within their respective mandates and intensify coordination to create synergy. Any mechanism operating in the name of the Security Council should follow the Council's rules and practice. Regional and sub-regional organizations are well informed of local context and can therefore play an important role and provide customized suggestions. Mr. President, as the host country of the Fourth World Conference on Women, China is firmly committed to gender equality and women empowerment. We will continue to work closely with the international community to advance the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, eliminate sexual violence in conflict, and build a peaceful and prosperous world where all women and girls can reach their full potential of development. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the ambassador of Russia. Vasily, you have the floor.
Christoph, Mr. President, thank you. Let me thank the special representative of the Secretary General and the invited speakers. Russian Federation strongly condemns all forms of violence against civilians in armed conflict, including sexual violence. We welcome various multi-country initiatives and individual efforts to properly address this evil of any war. Russia stands committed to international cooperation in this regard. We acknowledge the valuable contribution of the Special Representative, Ms. Pramila Patten, and her office. We appreciate her assistance in strengthening the national capacities to counter sexual violence, her dedication to develop dialogue, support victims, and draw public attention to the consequences of those heinous crimes. Last year, at the open debates on the same subject under the German presidency, the Secretary General said, I quote, "Despite all efforts, the reality on the ground has not changed. Sexual violence continues to be a horrific feature of conflict around the world." End quote. True, but sexual violence is not a standalone phenomenon. It is a dirty but inalienable, unfortunately, inalienable part of an armed conflict. It might be naive for international community to count on sniping at one particular crime in a situation of ongoing armed conflict. Eradication of war crimes goes along with resolving armed conflict itself. It is not possible to combat sexual violence without the active involvement of national authorities in this process. It is well recognized that the primary responsibility in protecting civilians in their territory is borne by the governments. Fighting impunity and ensuring accountability are the key parameters of a sovereign state. With increasing number of attacks by terrorist groups, including their use of sexual violence as a tactical war, we need to intensify our efforts to address the threat of terrorism. Justice must prevail in the battlefield or be properly adjudicated, primarily in courts where such crimes have been committed. We need to act jointly and vigorously. We must avoid politicization of this topic. Any information submitted for the attention of the Security Council must be verified. Speaking about human rights, it is important not to confuse the perspectives through which we are addressing the issue of sexual violence in armed conflict. It is crucial to clearly distinguish between sexual violence as a war crime and sexual violence as a criminal wrongdoing. The Security Council has to remain within its mandate of maintaining peace and security. We do not honor attempts to expand the interpretation of the relevant scope pertaining to armed conflict and post-conflict situations that has been agreed and laid down in the resolutions of the Security Council. Finally, Mr. President, United Nations and its affiliates must show up the highest standard of behavior. The zero-tolerance policy on sexual violence has to be applicable to all, including peacekeeping missions. Also, that relates mutatis mutandis to the humanitarian actors and non-governmental organizations that are legally operating in countries affected by armed conflict. Efficiency of the Security Council is directly linked to its ability to bridge different approaches through enhancing respective dialogue and constructive cooperation. We are committed to act accordingly in the interests of peace, supporting the victims of sexual violence, and for the sake of building just societies. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the ambassador of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. St. Vincent and the Grenadines welcomes the participation of all distinguished foreign ministers. We thank Germany for hosting this meeting, as well as the Dominican Republic for their role as co-chairs with Germany of the IAG on Women, Peace and Security. We are particularly grateful for the insightful briefings from SRSG Pramila Patten, UNHCR Special Envoy Angelina Jolie, representative of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, Kin Omar, and Executive President of the AFJC, Nadia Karine Fornel-Poutou. Mr. President, we begin by honoring the lives of all victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. We begin by recognizing their full humanity and paying heartfelt tribute to them for sharing their stories, captured in reports to the Security Council and other institutions at the local, national, and regional levels. We honor the countless untold stories of gendered violence in conflict, mainly against women and girls, but also against boys and men. The desires and solutions that emerge from the telling of these stories should serve as the primary point of departure for addressing the root causes of such violence. Mr. President, we are well aware that conflict-related sexual violence is produced and maintained in a context of insecurity and asymmetries of power that are historical, structural, institutionalized, and systemic. Against the backdrop of persistent underdevelopment in conflict-affected countries, gender justice, critical to the elimination of all forms of gendered violence, requires the implementation of comprehensive strategies that ensure the social, economic, and political participation of women and girls at all levels, in accordance with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As outlined in Resolution 2467 and in other fora, including the Peace and Security Council of the African Union during its 862nd session last year, we must transform a widespread culture of impunity into a culture of justice and accountability through consistent and effective prosecution, and by fostering national ownership and leadership of holistic, sustainable, as well as victim and survivor-centered responses. We welcome the recently established Global Survivor Fund in this regard. Responses must privilege the knowledge of diverse victims and survivors in their recovery, in judicial and other reparatory mechanisms, and in decision-making bodies. Local customs, traditions, and expertise should also be prioritized to develop institutional mechanisms that deliver justice and enhance accountability. These actions must be pursued alongside wider structural transformation to eliminate all gendered inequalities locally, nationally, and globally, while respecting the fundamental norms of sovereignty and political independence. While the production of national guidance documents, action plans, and operational tools, as well as the ongoing work to create and operationalize gender-responsive mission mandates, are all encouraging, progress remains frustratingly slow. As we mark milestone anniversaries in our United Nations, the Beijing Platform for Action, and the adoption of Resolution 1325, urgent progress is needed. This requires the consistent application of critical gender and political economy analyses within the peacekeeping and peacebuilding work of the Council to produce gender-responsive mandates that assist conflict-affected countries in reconfiguring their social, economic, and political landscapes to comprehensively address the challenges of sexual and gender-based violence. Excellencies, in closing, we join those who caution against divesting critical healthcare and social funding as a robust global response to the COVID-19 pandemic is necessary. COVID-19 responses must also include focused funding to ensure healthcare support for victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence amid reports of escalating violence, increased displacement, and a general intensification of protection challenges that disproportionately affect women and girls. We reaffirm that ending sexual and gender-based violence demands both the cessation of conflict and the elimination of all gendered inequality globally. I thank you.
Thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for her statement, and I give now the floor to the Ambassador of Indonesia, Jani.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Mr. President, colleagues, let me begin by thanking Germany for organizing this important meeting, and also my colleague, the Dominican Republic. I would also like to thank all briefers for their particularly important and eye-opening presentation. Indonesia is resolute in recognizing that conflict-related sexual violence is a crime against humanity. Despite a decade of concerted focus in Security Council to end this crime, we are still confronted with increasingly complex challenges to protect all survivors and their families, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. As clearly reported, the level of compliance by all parties to conflict remains low. Against that backdrop, I would like to focus my statement on 3 fundamental points. First, ensuring accountability in the fight against sexual violence. Strengthening the reach and capacity of national authorities is vital to facilitate access to justice and ensure that perpetrators are held accountable. The stigma of being victims of such heinous crimes often prevents them to come forward and seek justice. Therefore, by treating them as survivors rather than simply as victims, will help national authorities to address this issue better. We particularly commend some government efforts to put in place a more protective legal and policy framework for women and children at risk. But much still needs to be done, and by many other governments. In that particular regard, capacity building must be proportional and responsive for survivors in their reintegration process and to address the root causes of the culture of impunity. The second point is a comprehensive resocialization and reintegration process for survivors. Aside from justice, this agenda has strong connection to the access of healthcare and psychological support. The resocialization and reintegration support is even more urgent and challenging during this pandemic. We have no option but to empower survivors to live their life with dignity. We should provide assistance on quality services, economic support, healthcare services, as well as legal assistance so as to be seamlessly integrated into society. Promoting social reintegration and cohesion is important. Thus, it is critical to engage local communities, particularly religious leaders and women-led organizations, to mitigate stigma and fully reintegrate victims into society. Together, we can provide a reliable vehicle to enhance community-level protection and response mechanism. The third point is on meaningful participation to combat this crime, meaningful women's participation. Indonesia believes that the inclusion of women in peacekeeping mission may encourage victims to feel more secure working with and thereby helping them to eliminate sexual violence crimes. Women peacekeepers are well positioned to win the hearts and minds of affected communities. Therefore, we strongly encourage TPCCs to incentivize the percentage of women, military, and police in deployment to peacekeeping operation. Today, there are 159 Indonesian women peacekeepers in various missions who have been trained at the Indonesian Peacekeeping Operation Training Center to combat sexual violence in conflict. We must do things concretely nowadays. Combating these crimes also requires women participation as negotiators and mediators. Earlier this month, Indonesia hosted a webinar on the role of women negotiators and mediators in the maintenance of regional peace and security as a pathway to establish the network in Southeast Asia. Practitioners across the region shared their views on enhancing the role and participation on women in the peace process. Mr. President, today's debate is about standing behind justice and equity. We stand behind the brave survivors of sexual violence. We stand for their rights. Indonesia attaches great importance to effort in eliminating conflict-related sexual violence, in focusing on survivor-centered approach, and in fostering compliance with existing commitments. We must place the survivors at the heart of our works and in our heart. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Ambassador of Indonesia, Jani, for statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Estonia, Sven.
Dankeschön. Thank you, Mr. President. We thank all briefers for their presence and presentations. We thank the Secretary General for his report. while noting with alarm, again, his description of the global security environment in which sexual violence remains a cruel tactic of war, torture, terror, and political repression, and a brutally effective tool of displacement and dehumanization. We note with particular concern the attacks against women, human rights defenders, and political activists aimed to silence their voices in peace processes. The reports and their annexes presented to the Security Council over the years have in clear and grim detail laid out the information on conflict-related sexual violence. We are alarmed that 70% of the listed parties are persistent perpetrators appearing in the list for years and with impunity. We believe this information should feed into all Council discussions. Despite the increased focus and documentation, in only a fraction of cases there is accountability for sexual violence. This means that one of our most powerful tools to prevent it is not used. Discriminatory social norms and stigmatization prevent the survivors from reporting the cases of sexual violence and accessing information of services all over the world. This needs to be changed. In Iraq and Syria, thousands of women and girls were abducted and forced into sexual slavery over the last years. In Iraq, there are still no indictments for sexual violence committed by ISIL. No perpetrators have been prosecuted for sexual violence in Syria. In Myanmar, there has been no accountability despite the recommendations of the International Fact-Finding Mission, which found that sexual violence was a hallmark of the Tatmadaw operations in 2016 and 2017. We strongly support the Security Council mechanisms on sexual violence in conflict, including the field-based monitoring, reporting by the Secretary General and the Special Representative, and the work of the Informal Experts Group. We underline the importance of sufficient funding for women protection advisors. We note with concern the challenges posed to this monitoring and reporting by COVID-19 and call on the UN peace operations to maintain its focus on sexual violence. We welcome the inclusion of sexual violence as a designation criterion for the Council sanctions committees and support its application in practice. We look forward to increased briefings in the committees by the Special Representative. Estonia continues to support the team of experts in its cooperation with national institutions to address impunity and support victims. We underline the role of international accountability mechanisms, including the ICC, which, in an important step in 2019, found Bosco Ntaganda guilty of crimes against humanity, including rape and sexual slavery. We support the elements in Resolution 2467, describing a survivor-centered approach in responding to sexual violence. We believe it needs to be rights-based, responsive to the survivor's needs, and differentiated accordingly. Psychosocial and sexual and reproductive health services are an integral part of it. We cannot address sexual violence without ensuring gender equality. The disempowerment of women and girls increases their risk of violence, but also leads to negative coping measures and restricts their access to assistance and justice. We note to dismay the difficulties the Council continues to have in recognizing and addressing sexual violence in specific contexts, despite its clear condemnation of sexual violence in conflict. Overlooking this, we fail the survivors of violence, but we also fail in our principal task of maintaining peace and security. Sexual violence is a widespread and at times systemic feature of conflicts, and it can perpetuate the divisions and animosities driving conflict for years to come. Danke schön. Thank you, Mr. President.
Bitte schön, Sven. Thanks very much to the Ambassador of Estonia for his statement. And I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Vietnam, Key.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to extend our welcome and appreciation to all ministers for their statement. We thank the German presidencies and the American Republic for co-hosting this very important open debate. We would also like to express our appreciation to the Secretary General for his latest report and his special representative on sexual violence in conflict for a valuable briefing and other briefers for their insightful presentation. Mr. President, as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325, the 25th anniversary of the First World Conference on Women, and the 75th anniversary of UN, it is saddening to see that the multiple consequences of sexual violence continue to persist despite increasing commitment and progress achieved. War and conflict affect everyone, but often women and children remain the most to suffer from the lasting psychological and physical impacts. Lacking access to education, livelihood, and economic opportunity, these victims are also easily subjected to stigmatization, human trafficking, armed groups, and terrorist recruitment, which further the cycles of violence and suffering. Our response to conflict-related sexual violence requires a comprehensive approach of preventive and recovery measures, in addition to tackling its root causes, stemming from gender inequality. In this effort, we share the views of the Secretary General in his report that survivor-centered approach is imperative and remain concerned at existing gap between the commitment and implementation of commitment by parties to the conflict. With that in mind, I would like to make the following point. Firstly, victims of sexual violence must be provided with essential recovery services, including health care, psychological support, vocational training, employment opportunity, legal aid, and socio-economic reintegration. These measures should be taken together with effort to advance gender equality. We would like to highlight the importance of economic empowerment in enhancing women's recovery and capacity. States have the primarily responsibility in this regard, but complementary assistance from the international community, particularly the UN agency, programs, and peacekeeping missions, is equally crucial. It may include, but not limited to, the development assistance, capacity building, technical support, and training. Secondly, women are not only victims, but they are also the backbone of community. The equal representation and full involvement of women in decision-making processes is a prerequisite to conflict prevention and repressing sexual violence in conflict. This would ensure that initiatives promoted could be adequately address the needs and interests of victims, raise greater awareness, and overcome stigmatization against those who suffer from sexual violence. Thirdly, the international community should further strengthen cooperation and sharing experiences among countries and regions to allow for more consistent and effective implementation of the women, peace, and security agenda, as well as the conflict-related sexual violence aspect. We also call on a united and collective response to effectively implement existing normative frameworks to promote gender equality and women empowerment in the prevention and response to sexual violence and conflict. Mr. President, the path to prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence requires both immediate action and a long-term approach. In this pursuit, let us always be mindful of the perpetual suffering of victims who are at increasing risk of being left behind, and the indispensable role of women in all stages of peace processes. And at the phase of COVID-19 pandemic, protection and empowerment of women should be paid even more attention. Vietnam is committed to working closely with member states and the United Nations relevant agency in this endeavor. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. Thank you, Key. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now give the floor back to our briefers and ask them to respond to comments or questions that have been raised. I give the floor first to Ms. Patten. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Maybe to continue on the metaphor of His Excellency, the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, I fully agree that the only cure for these overlapping ills is an injection of greater political resolve and financial resources. Special Envoy Angelina Jolie reminded us of the painful plight of the Yazidi community and the chronic underspending of global humanitarian assistance on gender-based violence prevention and response. And indeed, although it is estimated that 1 in 5 internally displaced or refugee women has experienced sexual violence, less than 1% of global humanitarian aid is allocated to this issue. Mr. President, we have the normative frameworks, we have the institutional mechanisms, including my office, a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence, as well as UN Action Coordination Network. What we need now is to enhance operational impact and to turn these groundbreaking resolutions into lasting solutions on the ground. Mr. President, when this Council speaks, its words carry a particular weight in the world. In the case of Central African Republic, for example, this Council can send an unequivocal message to all parties to the peace accord that peace does not mean de facto amnesty. All those responsible for committing, commanding, or condoning sexual violence will be sanctioned and will be held to account. Justice may be delayed in many cases, but it will not be denied. As briefer Ms. Poutou reminded us today, justice and accountability are foundational for reconciliation and durable peace. Likewise, on Myanmar, following the cogent briefing of Mrs. Omar, we all must continue to push for the full implementation of the joint communique on conflict-related sexual violence, the adoption of the law on the prevention of violence against women, humanitarian access to conflict-affected communities, and profound and lasting security sector reform. Mr. President, in this 20th anniversary year, it's time to recognize that if we are to break the vicious cycle of war and sexual violence once and for all, we must dig deeper to tackle the root causes of structural gender inequality and militarization. We must convert political economies of war into political economies of peace building and cultures of impunity into cultures of deterrence. We must reimagine a world in which all survivors, especially women, are supported and empowered to assume their rightful roles as political leaders and agents of change. The history of wartime rape has been a history of denial. We need to continue generating data as an evidence base for action. We need to ensure that women's rights defenders and civil society organizations on the front lines never have to risk their lives to do their work. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would really like to add that I'm truly encouraged and honored to see consensus and support of the Security Council to this mandate, and more importantly, to all the victims and survivors which are at the heart of this agenda. The support of the Council around this issue reflects the continued evidence of the solid interlinkages between conflict-related sexual violence and the maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramila, for your additional statement. And I now give the floor to Ms. Kin Omar. You have the floor. You have to unmute yourself. We don't hear you yet. We still don't hear you. I propose that we go to Ms. Fornel-Poutou, and then we come back to Ms. Kin Omar, and maybe in the meantime we can somehow resolve the challenge there. Madame Fornel-Poutou, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Tout ce que j'ai à dire, c'est de vous remercier, de remercier tout le monde, tous ceux qui ont contribué à la réussite de ce débat. Et je pense que tout ce qui a été dit ici sera concrétisé dans les faits, surtout pour l'accès à la justice et la lutte contre l'impunité, les violences sexuelles en période de conflit. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
You are the only participant.
Now we don't have a translator. I think under the control of our French-speaking colleagues, I think Ms. Fornel-Poutou insisted on the importance of everything that was said, politically said, that this is actually implemented. Now we go to Ms. Kin Omar again, but I see that we have lost her. Scott, what do you suggest we do?
President, she's trying to reconnect now. If you can give her 1 minute, otherwise you may wish to draw the meeting to a close. If you could just give her 30 seconds now, she's trying to reconnect. Thank you.
Yes, I will do this. So please bear with me for a little bit of time. Give her 1 more minute.
Any update from the bridge on her connection status, please?
Do you understand me? And I hope we will understand you. So you have the floor. You have the floor again.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. During this 20th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, I remind this Council that gender equality and women's human rights are a fundamental part of the Peace and Security Agenda, and you have reaffirmed this over 20 years in 10 resolutions. Now, as the theme of this year's open debate clearly states, you have the opportunity to take a step forward and turn those commitments into real accountability. Myanmar is a clear example of a country where such accountability is badly needed, the accountability that is robust international accountability. The continued use of rape as a weapon of war by Myanmar's military, even as an element of genocide against ethnic communities, continues a threat to international peace and security. As I highlighted in my statement, domestic accountability in Myanmar is not possible. The military's so-called clearance operations are continuing unabated. Even last month, there were new reports of rape in Rakhine State. I therefore urge the Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the ICC, or to create an ad hoc tribunal to ensure that survivors of gender-based violence get justice. Women in the conflict areas in Myanmar live in fear every day and every night. And this is the real situation for them. Without your support and holding the Myanmar military to account, we have no future for this country. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Keen Omar for her additional comments. There are no more speakers on the list. Thank you all for your patience. This was from the German presidency this second time we had the item on our agenda. We had it last year with the adoption of 2467. We have the debate this year in the 20th anniversary of 1325. And in all the comments and speech given, everybody underlined the importance of the subject, and I thank you all for your contributions. The meeting is adjourned.
Enter the event panelist numeric password, followed by #. This meeting is being recorded.
So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. And we just had a very good, very substantive debate on sexual violence in conflict. And we picked up where we left last year after the adoption of 2467. And it was very good to have the SRSG here, Pramila Patten, who has been a driving force on the issue. And Pramila, maybe you want to say still a few words and be ready for questions. Again, thank you so much for briefing the Council today and for all the work you are doing. Thank you. You have to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted? No?
Yes, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to thank you for your leadership in convening this debate, now for the second time in a row. And I also wish to thank everyone for attending this virtual press takeout on the Security Council open debate that finished some minutes ago. As I said, the annual report of the Secretary General before us today paints a harrowing picture of sexual violence used as a tactic of war, torture, and terror, and a tool of political repression. What we see from this report again and again is that conflict-related sexual violence remains chronically underreported. And this is fueled by patterns of entrenched gender inequality, fear, stigma, or unavailability of services, which all become obstacles impeding survivors to report or seek assistance. The 2019 report recorded 2,838 cases, to be precise, in 19 countries. Data obtained through United Nations verified information. And of course, while this information does not reflect the scale and prevalence of these crimes, it served to illustrate the severity of this crime. Just to give you some highlights, women and girls account for more than 2,500 of the reported cases. And in 848 cases, the victims were children, and girls account for 803, so 95% of the cases. What comes out very clearly from the report as well is that comprehensive services for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence remain chronically underfunded, leaving many unable to simply meet their basic needs in the aftermath of these atrocities. And these including on sexual and reproductive healthcare, impede the coverage and reach of life-saving and potentially life-changing interventions. The report also brings out very clearly that despite some emblematic prosecutions and convictions in 2019, notably in the DRC, impunity remains the rule and justice and accountability the rare exception. The report also demonstrates how violence does not stop with the official ceasefire or the signing of the peace agreement, as can be seen in South Sudan, Central African Republic, or Colombia. On a more positive note, I must say that my mandate has accomplished many important milestones during the last decade, and I want to make specific reference to women protection advisors that are now deployed in 7 peace operations and special political missions. They have considerably enhanced data collection and analysis on conflict-related sexual violence. And just to give you an indication, more than 2,400 cases, 86% of the total number of cases, were reported in the countries where women protection advisors are deployed. And all these peace operations, with protection of civilian mandates, and 2 special political missions, Iraq and Somalia, have established the monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on conflict-related sexual violence to guide the prevention and response strategies to conflict-related sexual violence. The team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict continue to carry out targeted and specialized support to national rule of law institutions. And in 2019, the team of experts was deployed in Central African Republic, Côte d'Ivoire, DRC, Guinea, South Sudan, among other countries, to technically and financially back nationally led strategies aimed at tackling impunity for sexual violence. And their technical support has resulted in the prosecution and conviction of a number of emblematic cases, such as in the DRC. And I also must add that in 2019, the United Nations Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, known as the UN Action Network, which comprises of now 15 UN entities on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence, has funded no less than 9 projects to address conflict-related sexual violence. To date, my office has signed 10 joint communiques or frameworks of cooperation with states to address sexual violence in conflict. And in 2019 alone, I signed joint communique with the governments of Mali, Central African Republic, and the DRC. And also 7 state actors have assumed formal commitments to address CRSV. I would like to conclude by reiterating the importance of the focus of today's open debate, that this year marks the dawn of a new decade of action for sexual violence in conflict mandate. And in this new decade of action, the aim is really to move from commitments to compliance and from resolutions to solutions and results. And for this, we need to build from the achievements of the past and focus our efforts in critical areas, with an emphasis on empowering survivors, holding perpetrators accountable, and ensuring compliance of parties to the conflict with international obligations. Well, with this, I'd like to thank you again, and I'll be very happy to respond to any of your questions.
Thank you. Lenka, you have a question? Anybody else?
Okay, I will be happy to ask. I was wondering, thank you for the briefing. I was wondering, do you think that the Security Council should do more in the future regarding this topic? Of course, we had an open debate today, which is a great thing, but should there be more active in the future? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this question. And in fact, in my briefing before the Security Council, I highlighted that for the first time, the report actually contains a gap assessment, which really throws a lot of light on the whole issue around compliance of states parties. Of parties listed in the annex to the SG's report. I drew the attention of the Council on the importance of fostering compliance by parties to the conflict to international norms, which is critical to sustainably address these horrible practices in conflict zones. And I encourage the Security Council to monitor and ensure compliance, including through greater coherence and alignment between the list of credibly suspected perpetrators in the annex to the report and the actions taken by the Sanctions Committee. The gap assessment section in the report, which actually is mandated by the Security Council in its operative paragraph 5 of Resolution 2467, which was adopted last year in April. This section underscores the prevailing lack of compliance by parties to conflict with international obligations and the absence of commitments by persistent perpetrators to prevent the violations for which they are cited in the annex to the report.
Okay, thank you. Only to say that from German perspective, as long as we are in the Security Council, we'll continue to have this item on the agenda, and when we have country situations, we'll this issue. So thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon. And again, Pramila, thank you so much for your engagement, and again for the cooperation also between our teams. So all the best to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.